Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and I've gone on record as saying that Mega Man X is my favorite game of all time. Capcom also seemed to think highly of it since it's one of the few titles in the franchise to get a remake and not just a port, in the form of Maverick Hunter X for Sony PSP. On the surface, it's a one-to-one remake, things being largely the same outside of graphics and sound, but if you played the original as much as I have, you notice that there have been a lot of small changes. I'm ready to give the remake a look, and since I've already done a review of the original, I'll just gloss over the basics and try to focus mostly on what's different. Let's see if I can spot them all. The plot reads like an expanded version of the original. Dr. Kane finds X and uses his designs to create Reploids. Sigma turns against humanity and creates a following that the Maverick Hunters, most notably X and Zero, have to put down. Vile hates everyone. Bam, nice and simple. Except not. Each regular boss has dialogue before you fight, filling out their character more. There's a few anime cutscenes at some junctions, further expanding the lore, and there's an unlockable movie, Day of Sigma, which is a prequel that shows how Sigma went from the leader of the Hunters and pals with X and Zero to the big bad. And just in case anyone thinks that this is just the same as the original, with extra details and more specifics thrown in, there's some pretty major deviations that set it apart as a separate canon. Things are darker, Sigma is oddly obsessed with X, Bile's motivation is filled in beyond him just being a jerk, and our boy can use Shining Finger, not to mention all the stuff with Dr. Kane. Day of Sigma is available on the X Legacy Collection, plus I'm sure you can find it somewhere on YouTube, so I'd recommend checking it out. The changes could be its own video though, so just keep in mind that this isn't just a simple retelling. For just a few miscellaneous mechanical changes, you can now save your game rather than having to scribble down a password on a napkin. And you can also alter settings like button mapping and sound levels in-game, rather than just at the start screen. When you die, your weapon ammo refills. Your starting life counter is set to 2 extras. If you leave one stage with less than that, you'll be brought up to 3 tries, but if you exit with more than the norm, like 5, they'll let you keep that instead, whichever is higher, which is very nice. No needing to strategically game over to reset your counter. The stage select is also a bit different. It's still having the 8 main levels posted, but it also includes one for the intro stage, as well as letting you select Sigma stages individually as you unlock them, rather than forcing you to just hammer them out in order, no going back. Once you beat the game, they also reset the levels when you reload your file, not only throwing the bosses back in, but also returning them to their default state, rather than the altered ones you get if you beat a certain boss, like Flooding Chameleon's stage once you beat Octopus. Things are dry once again. It can be pretty fun to rush through them again once you're fully built up, but it also seems like a bit of a missed opportunity since there's no high score system or time trials implemented, which would have really added some extra value in retracing your steps. Still a net positive though. You still jump, shoot, and dash with X, and he can still charge his weapons, but his shots no longer can fire through walls, which bothers me a lot, I will admit. He can also plink with his Buster even when he has a special weapon up. When charging up his Buster, he doesn't change color as much, so you need to listen more for a sound cue when it gets up to full power. Speaking of, the Light Buster no longer puts out that extra bit of energy that splashes behind you for defense against pursuing enemies. There's also a bonus Buster. If you miss the capsule and get the upgrade from Zero, you actually get a different version that shoots out a red blast at full power that does a lot of damage to bosses, which is kinda funny given how late you get it here. As for the Hadoken, it's still here, but instead of getting to the end of Armored Armadillo's stage fully upgraded and at full life 3 or 4 times, instead you just need to get there once, while taking no damage. This can be tricky at first, but if you re-enter the stage with a rolling shield and a charge, you can get through it without a lot of trouble. That's because of one of the few weapon tweaks here. You can charge either the Chameleon Sting or Rolling Shield, then swap weapons while keeping the effect. And since it takes a pretty meaty hit to lower the shield, you can just kind of ignore most smaller enemies while using a much more powerful weapon for the stronger ones, which feels really broken. But I love exploits, so no complaints from me. The charged electric spark is also different, it's seeming to just zap everything on screen, though given how much ground the original covered, it doesn't actually change too much in practice. Charged Storm Tornado also gets thrown out rather than just coming out right on top of you. In general though, the game seems to encourage you to use your special weapons a lot more. I've never counted, but it feels like most have more weapon ammo this time, though that could be because of how often refills seem to drop. Health seems to pop up a lot less, and I'd sometimes need to actually go out of my way to grind up my sub-tanks before the Sigma fight, instead of having those puppies filled stages before, without even trying. Though maybe I just had bad luck. Either way, I could get away without needing to conserve my weapons, and since my Buster Shots couldn't travel through walls but my Storm Tornadoes could, I was only too happy to take them up on that. So yeah, while subtle, they definitely changed our boy up enough that veterans might have to adjust their playstyle. There's also a second playable character, Vile, and the way he works is pretty unique. You have 3 different attack buttons, one for his arm weapons, one for his shoulder cannon, and one for his knees. Using one will burn some weapon energy, the stronger the more that it drains, but it refills pretty quick so that the lighter ones you can use almost non-stop, whereas too much spamming or just more powerful ones will require you to catch your breath. Using the cannon or leg forces you to stay in place as you fire, which can open you up to attack, but you can also use it to stay in the air for an extra second. You can swap your loadout before entering a stage, you being able to equip one weapon for each part, but you only have so many equip points you can use at once, though your max does increase as you progress. While you can get away with a lot of stuff near endgame, at the start, you kinda need to decide whether you'll have a balanced loadout, or if you just want to put it all into one weapon and have the other 2 be really basic. Of course, at the start, you only have a standard armament for each slot. You get new weapons from killing bosses, though this isn't quite as straightforward as you might think. Beating a boss will give you 2 or 3, but most unlock a specific type of weapon that, when combined with elements from other bosses, form new weapons, like Launch Octopus granting you missiles, and Sting Chameleon adding in a version that splits into 3. For arms, you get finger bullets, missiles, and rocket punches. Cannons, different shots, lasers, and boomerangs. And legs, bombs, balls, and flamethrowers. Each also interact differently with bosses, the Rangs still cutting off limbs from Octopus and Mammoth, electric dropping Armadillo's armor, and ice weapons not freezing Mandrill but still kicking his butt, so it can be important to remember where you got each from, some more obvious than others, to exploit weaknesses. And there are way too many for me to go over here. Probably too many to even get around to in a single playthrough unless you're visiting the stage select a lot, but I will link to a guide that gives a basic rundown that helped me out too. There's also 2 bonus unlocks. Beat Chill Penguin to get the Ice Castle, which grants armor that halves damage, since Vile gets no capsules. And because all the buttons are probably stuck doing something else, Vile has no dash, but gets the Speed Devil from Storm Eagle, which increases his basic movement speed. Both of these are massively important, since Vile takes a lot of damage starting out and some upgrades can't be reached with his basic speed, so keep these in mind when playing. Though speaking of increased damage, health refills do seem to drop more frequently for him compared to X. Lastly, there's the Ride Armor. Kind of Vile's signature thing, but he doesn't actually get to play around with them much, ironically. There's a few specific places. Jumping in will start a timer and the Ride Armor will explode when it hits 0 or he jumps out, though getting weapon energy will extend the timer. The armor can punch and also fire a spray of bullets, as well as dash. Getting these tend to be less a power trip and more a test of your efficiency using them, since most need to be used to get you in a position to collect a specific power-up within the time limit. Vile's an interesting addition since he offers not just a unique gameplay experience, but is also a character that starts out incredibly weak but becomes more monstrous the further you get. And yeah, I know X does something similar with his armor and power-up collection, but it is so much more pronounced with Vile to the point where the intro stage and whichever level you choose to tackle first will likely be the hardest by far. The stages are largely the same. Beating some will still affect others in the same way, beating Penguin still freezes over Mammoth's lava, and taking out Eagle still crashes the Death Rogamer into Mandrill's place, etc. Each stage does get some slight tweaks, like you having to deal with the wheels instead of the drones in Kuwanger's elevator, or the sub-tank for Mammoth requiring the helmet, rather than just the boots to break the blocks blocking it off. To go over all of them would be really boring and make me sound like a huge nerd, but in a neurotic way. So I won't. Just know that they're at least 90% what you got on the Super Nintendo. The big change that they made here is actually the armor upgrade locations. The capsules are where they originally were, or at least close, but which gives what piece have been remixed, and this changes up things more than you think. Rather than just go for the obvious Penguin boots and easy out first, now you need to go for Mammoth if you want the dash, but if you start there, everything's still on fire, and if you stick with Penguin, you'll miss out on the 2 upgrades his stage holds. If you do it right, you can still get everything while only having to redo just 1 level, but it does make you rethink things and reconsider what the optimal order is. It's also nice that I don't have to spend 10 minutes trying to get the Buster upgrade now too. The rest of the upgrades are pretty much in the same places, a few having small tweaks, like Mammoth sub-tank that I mentioned earlier, or the platform with the Heart Tank and Mandrills now being too long for you to wall dash up to. There's a part of me that wished they'd have remixed things like they did with the armor, but I guess it wouldn't make much sense if they did. If they put the heart tank from Chameleon where you typically get the heart tank from Octopus, literally nothing would change, so that'd be pointless. I guess they could have rehidden them, but that could require some pretty big stage tweaks, and I'm only complaining about it since the armor shuffle is so interesting. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have given it much thought, so I guess I should just be happy with what we got. As for Vile, he has the same stage layouts but with new enemy placements, often nastier ones, and new locations for his tanks. Some of them are just thrown in, some get new cubbies that I don't think are present in X's campaign, but it wouldn't really change much if they were. Honestly, it'd be just another eyebrow raise, like when I find an empty space with Vile where X's upgrade would normally be. Some of the sub-tanks in particular require the ride armor, so making it last long enough for you to get an extra jump height, or destroy a specific obstacle is key, requiring some skill, level familiarity, and luck. I don't think I've 100%ed him yet. There's also a few parts that are harder for Vile, like in Armored Armadillo's level, where they get rid of the roller platforms that force him to not only walk and deal with each threat as he goes, but also makes it so that to clear the gap to get to the boss room, you need to cross heli platforms. The Sigma stages, though, get heavily remixed. There's some classic fixtures, like the heli platforms that lead into the main fortress, guess they were a favorite, but most are completely new. The boss rematches are more evenly spread out, rather than most of them being saved for the end, and it's also easier to predict who you'll be fighting, since most have some of their stage elements thrown in leading up to their room. For instance, Mammoth has lava and conveyor belts, and Mandrill has the lightning bugs and some electric equipment in the background. The Bow Spider also has a lot of webbing thrown in before you reach it. I really like this change-up, since not only does it feel like the theming is stronger, it also keeps things fresh for those who have played the original X way too many times. They even go so far as putting the Bile fight at the end of the third stage, which not only makes it feel that much more impactful, but since that means you can't get free Zero Buster until right before D-Rex, putting it off is another thing you need to reconsider. The only part of all this that really bugs me is the beginning of the second stage. There are walls you need to break that take a lot of damage, and even with just spamming the Storm Tornado, it still takes some effort. That's annoying, but there's also a mining tank that can get the jump on you that not only feels cheap, but until you figure out the best way to cheese it, is another major irritant. Anyway, last stage is the same, except there's one less hole infinitely spawning caterpillars, and you really only need one of those anyway, so no biggie. Overall, Original X had great stages, with some cool gimmicks, so the same is true here, go figure. The few small tweaks do bug me a bit, like the heart tank that now requires a boomerang, and them changing the elevation of the tortoises and Kuwangers level since you can normally shoot through walls. There's also some of the new vertical sections in the first Sigma stage where I don't think there's enough forewarning where higher up enemies are, but I have to admit that I might not have that complaint for the original just because I have the stages memorized. Regardless of the reason, these gripes are so small that the remix bits counteract them, since anything that makes me rethink and adjust my approach to a game that I played countless times is really cool and a great feeling. I very much approve. The basic enemies are also mostly the same, some receiving light redesigns but having the same attack patterns. They've done a little more with the sub-bosses, the submarine and launch octopuses stage now having a heavy jaw shielding that you have to contend with, and all of them seem to die a lot quicker now. I'm sure that'll get a mixed response, and I myself am of two minds. The aquatic ones could be kind of annoying, especially the subs, so speeding them up is nice, but it feels like it kinda takes away the point from some of the others. The mining tanks were all about figuring out how to destroy them fast, before they cut off your opportunity to grab an upgrade or power up, and the green clawed guy was meant to be an endurance test, since he really didn't have anything other than high HP going for him. Taking them out with one or two storm tornadoes feels really anticlimactic, like why even bother putting an enemy here? But maybe the point of the sumo bot guarding the armor having a ton of HP was to create a sense of theming. Since he's guarding the Buster now, maybe it would have really hurt if he'd managed to catch me instead. He didn't though, so I can't say. The bosses themselves have received redesigns, and while they keep their attack patterns, some have something extra. When Eagle pushes you back by flapping his wings, he also drops feathers that you need to keep in between to avoid contact damage. Boomer Kuwanger, who's been replaced with some schmuck named Boomerang Kuwanger, dances when he starts to teleport, and the trajectories of Armadillo's ricochets are also different, and he also gets an attack that has him dashing around the surfaces of the room. And if you kick things up to hard, oh ho ho, even more attacks are thrown in, but we'll talk about that when we get to difficulty. One other thing is that hitting each with their weaknesses tends to produce a bigger effect, with more flinching. While not quite Spark Mandrill level, outside of Spark Mandrill, it isn't terribly hard to make sure some of these guys never get to attack. I really noticed it with Octopus, who flips around as he stumbles, though others like Huwanger still get enough iframes that you can't reduce them to a staggering mess. As for the Fortress bosses, Bowspider has 5 poles now that it can swap between and also seems slower, so it's a lot easier to take out. Rangda Bangda changes up slightly, sometimes there being more than one eye at once, and when you kill the nose, the screen only gets partially squished, you still having some actual floor space. The rest only seem to change when you go into hard mode. And for a special treat, spoiler for Vile's campaign from an 18-year-old game, you fight X and Zero as his finale, rather than going on to Sigma. The two fight together, and while they share a health bar, they have separate health values. X uses his Buster, along with a number of boss weapons, including a charged rolling shield, while Zero will block, use a powerful charge shot, and 1 or 2 physical attacks as well, like an uppercut into a dive. When they both come out at the same time, they will either combine their moves for bigger attacks, or just both attack you at the same time individually to overwhelm you. It's a pretty memorable fight, and the only one to get me to actually use my sub-tanks, so a decent challenge. You also get to battle Vile in his ride armor in the intro stage, rather than just throwing the fight, and Vile goes up against an X that just plinks for his. On the whole, much like the stages, the original was good, so the remake is too. And that hard mode. Moving right along, original music was good, so what we get here is good as well, though it definitely has a different feel to it. The original game was on the Super Nintendo, which of course came with more limitations, and they pushed things to the max and came up with something that felt really rockin'. Maverick Hunter has a lot more leeway with what it does, and as such, you get more of a range. There's definitely a lot of rocking bits here, but some of them also feel smoother and more chill. Not to say that there aren't still plenty to keep your pulse pumping, the vibe each remix gives off just feels more catered to its assigned stage, giving the soundtrack more variety, compared to the SNES version, which had its own strong but more singular identity. A few new tracks have been thrown in, mostly in Vile's campaign, the main one being his stage theme. It's pretty good, it still feels very Mega Man X, but somehow nastier and harsher, much like Vile himself. Unfortunately though, since they play this not just for his intro stage, but for all of the regular levels, it kind of wears out its welcome and runs a little stale, and when you get back to remixes for the Sigma stages, it feels like a breath of fresh air. But still, new music is nice, whether wholly original or just a new rendition of an old classic. Also worth noting in the sound department is the voice acting. All major characters get voice dialogue, and most are pretty good. I think X sounds good, and Gilbertson is still my favorite VA for Zero. As for the Maverick bosses, some are more serious, like Eagle and Kuwanger, some are more cartoony, like Chameleon and Penguin, and some are not what I was expecting. Never would have given Octopus a foppish voice that makes him sound like a stuck-up artist, but you know what? It kinda works. The only one I'm not really crazy about is Vile's, since he just kinda sounds like a jerk, which I know seems right, but he sounds more like a high school bully, rather than a big-time bad guy who just wants to kill everybody because he's a psychopath. On the whole though, I think they did a good job with casting and voice direction, but I have one more complaint. X and a lot of the regular bosses do the whole DBZ thing, calling out the names of their special attacks. I like Dragon Ball, so I'd normally find it fun, but when you're spamming one special over and over again, it kinda loses its novelty. If they did it every 3 or 4 attacks, I'd probably give it a pass. Maybe there's a toggle somewhere I missed. As for visuals, it's early 3D, which I tend to think ages horribly. I don't know, I can tolerate the visuals on the rest of the later X titles like 7, 8, and Command Mission, which I know have their fair share of critics, but for some reason, the polygons really stand out for me and a lot of the enemies wind up looking like toys, the cheap kind. Not the sort I'd want to display. Ironic, since some of the objects, like the light capsules and power-ups, look exactly like they do in X8. It might just be because I have a direct line of comparison with the SNES sprites, so I have a clear image of what I think things should look like. Not only that, but each boss has gotten a redesign, and while a lot of them have some interesting tweaks thrown in, like Armadillo's shields being handheld objects that he can twirl, and Eagle being taller and having an actual neck, I just look at them and think, they were perfect the way they were, why change them? Giving Mandrill a drill because haha, and Mammoth strangely gyrating, drawing attention to his crotch plate probably doesn't help. But back to the 3D, I sometimes also have trouble reading the hitboxes on things. With pixels, things tend to be pretty clear, with distinct lines signaling where something ends and begins, but there were a lot of times, especially in the Sigma stages, where something either stuck out further or not as far as I thought, and it'd throw off my movements. Made a similar complaint with X8 when I reviewed that as well. 3D can just make it harder to tell what's more foreground, what's more background at points. I think the worst was with Final Sigma though. I never missed the big old goofy wolf snout on the Super Nintendo, but here I'd find my rolling shield rolling right off its chin. Never good, especially on hard mode. One last visual element is the UI. Up top, you can see your suite of weapons, and the order they're in if you want a shoulder switch, and that's good. Next to that, you can see your health, and bosses have a similar bar on their side. These are tiny, not just in the standard handheld, even when I blow it up on the TV, and I think you can get some partial ticks of health with color gradients, making it hard to tell exactly how much health you or your opponent has left, which is bad. There have been some enemies that have taken a lot more hits than I thought they would, and I've also died because I wound up not being able to take as many hits as I figured I could. I know that space is kind of at a premium on smaller screens, but it still feels like the health bars could have been stretched out a bit more. There are two difficulty settings, normal and hard. Normal is normal, hard has you taking more damage, and giving extra moves to bosses. Ooh! They've given us both of the difficulty tweaks that I find the lamest and the most interesting, the latter being a bigger deal to me, so you know what, I'm giving them a pass. Some of them I don't really notice much of a difference for, so they might just be a bit more aggressive. Like I think Octopus uses his Piranha missiles more frequently, but Armadillo gets a more unpredictable bounce cycle while also throwing out projectiles, and Chill Penguin actually gets shotgun ice, which can be pretty hard to dodge. Imagine that, the Weenie Boss not only gets his signature move, he even becomes a challenge. At this point, I played the original X so much that nothing in it is really challenging, so them changing up some of the elements that have been baked into my DNA, making me relearn boss patterns and adjust my strategy is a lot of fun. As for how I'd rate the basic difficulty, X Normal is about as hard as the original X. Yeah, it's a Mega Man game, so newcomers are going to be challenged, but veterans will likely find it one of the easier titles, though the small tweaks might throw some for a loop. Hard mode amps things up enough that it's a decent challenge for fans of the original, but it didn't take me too long to get this down too. Once again, it all comes down to experience. I think we can call it a step up, but not a huge leap. Vile, though, is kind of interesting. When you start out, he sucks. He's pretty fragile, and unlike X, who can run around and collect the armor parts, building himself up until he's ready to take on a boss, Vile needs to actually beat bosses for his damage reduction and speed options. Not only that, but he tends to have stronger enemies to contend with, some with really unfair placements, some of the helpful tools and stages have been removed for him, some of his upgrades require real skill to get as opposed to just memorizing a location, and it takes a lot of experimenting to find the loadout that works for you, and you need to leave a level just to change it. Makes it hard to tell whether the developers really liked Vile and wanted to put him in, or really hated him and wanted to make him suffer. As the game goes along though, and you build up not just his stats, but the number of weapons you can equip and the points you had to equip them with, he starts just kinda destroying the game. While a lot of video game characters get stronger the further in you get, Vile's campaign just seems to get easier the deeper you go. It's kinda ridiculous. Still, getting to that point can be hard, so I'd say that normal is a decent challenge and hard is just sadistic. It took me around a half hour just to get through the intro stage, since Vile can just not take a hit, and it took me even longer just to beat a single regular stage, though once I did, I started picking up speed and the rest fell like dominoes. To sum it up, Maverick Hunter X is pretty much as challenging as you want it to be. All of this brings up the question of which is the superior version of the game. If you've been paying attention, you should know the gist when it comes to the changes, but a quick summary would be the 3D sprites, redone music and voice acting, some quality of life stuff, tweaks to X's gameplay to make him more in line with the PS1 titles, an extra Vile campaign in hard mode, and some slight changes to regular levels, with the Sigma stages being largely redone. Also a demo for Powered Up, if you're still on the fence. With that all laid out, the remake is probably the obvious choice, but I actually still prefer the original, though only slightly. I like how X plays in that more. I think the UI is easier to read, I prefer pixels to early 3D, and also find it easier to tell what ends where with flat sprites. I like the music from the Super Nintendo more, the dash feels a bit smoother to me, and grinding sub-tanks is less of an issue. Not only that, but it's easier to lose boomerangs that travel off screen, and the slight changes to the stages really screw with me. Like, I have no idea how to get around some of the flamethrowers in Storm Eagle's stage. And while the original did have slowdown in some places, I noticed it a lot more here in Maverick Hunter, there being some points where slowdown would eat my inputs. Abusing the Storm Tornado might have contributed to this though. And while this might sound completely ass backwards, I think there's also some appeal to the password system the cartridge had. This doesn't affect me much, since I always beat these games in one sitting, but with passwords, you could share them with friends or family. If you were stuck on a particular part, you could look up one to bypass something, and you could even doctor them to get a specific loadout. I guess you could say that there's a sense of community with passwords that's lacking with save files, so that something seemingly as straightforward as this could still be a matter of preference. All that said, I will not for a minute deny how much the extra modes, the busters for X and armaments for Vile, add layers of replay value to a game that you can already play into the ground and still never get tired of. Yeah, nostalgia's probably coloring my view a little bit, but I don't think that invalidates my opinion that both of these versions are very worth playing, which is pretty much the best case scenario for a remake. The new version doesn't bungle things so badly that it retroactively ruins your childhood, nor does it overshadow the original so much that it might as well be discarded. If you're a more casual player and are the type to only play through a game once, you might want to choose just one then. I'd say go with whatever looks and sounds better to you, since the extra modes probably won't be as much of a selling point in that case. For everyone else, play both. The original Mega Man X is my favorite game of all time, so I might be biased, but if I'm telling you that the remake is on the same level and which is better all comes down to preference, I think that speaks volumes. So get out there and buy both on whatever hardware that's convenient for you. Wait, what do you mean Capcom only ever released Maverick Hunter on PSP? It's been almost 20 years and they love selling us the same crap over and over again. I do have to wonder why Maverick Hunter X never did well enough to keep the series going. From what I hear, they meant to go up to at least X6, which could have really fixed some problems some of those games had, especially at the tail end, and whenever you hear people talk about the remake, they generally have positive opinions on it, so a continuation seems like a no-brainer. I attributed it to the PSP being kind of a failure, but it was recently pointed out to me that no, that console actually did pretty well and it was the Vita that had not as stellar sales. When poking around on the subject, some cited the oversaturation problem again. Some said that it might have just dropped too early on the platform before it really took off. Others said that it was too easy to pirate stuff on the PSP, and still more said that it might have been because Mega Man was seen as a more Nintendo property, so the series jumping ship might have abandoned too large of a portion of its audience. These were all just supposition though, and whatever the case, this 6 or more series ended up being just a one-off. I still lament, thinking about what could have been, and I know I'm not the only one, though at least the game shows the potential of what a remake can be, even when a game is considered perfect. All you people saying that there's no reason to remake Super Metroid or Link to the Past because we still have the originals need to give this one a look. But hey, what about you? Do you think one version's better than the other? Which parts do you prefer on each, and have you even gotten a chance to play it? How fast would you snatch up a re-release? Seriously dropping the ball on this one, Capcom. That'll do it for this week, so thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into platformers, especially Mega Man. Now you as well, listen to my dulcet tones as I continually yell, Shotgun Ice.
This is what it's like.